Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 7th session of the Tech and Innovation Center series, part of the Local Infrastructure Hub. As you join the Zoom and get settled in, I'll welcome you to share your name, role, and org in the chat so we can all get a sense of who's here with us today. My name is Tina Walla, and I'm the Chief Partnerships Officer at U.S. Digital Response, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit that provides pro bono technology support to governments. This series is part of the Local Infrastructure Hub, which aims to help America's towns and cities take full advantage of federal infrastructure funding by providing them with information to create competitive winning bids for federal grant funding and to deliver real results for residents. This session is brought to you today by Cornell Tech and U.S. Digital Response and is supported by our funders, Bloomberg Philanthropies, Ballmer Group, Emerson Collective, Ford Foundation, and the Kresge Foundation. Now, either for those of you who are joining us today for the first time, or as a refresher for those of you who have come to some of our previous sessions, I want to ground us in why we're here. The Tech and Innovation Center aims to inspire local government leaders about the integration of technology that improves city infrastructure, not just today, but for the years to come. We have 4 key values that guide this series, as shown on this slide. First, we're driven by shared goals. We do not believe in doing tech for tech's sake. Second, we want to design for people. We recognize that technology, processes, and products have to reflect the needs and desires of deeply diverse individuals and groups. We are not all the same. Third, we believe in approaching this work with a commitment to resourcing this work. In this unique moment where there's a lot of federal funding available, we want to think long-term about sustainability, and that includes planning for workforce, policies, and regulations. And last but certainly not least, we want to build for trust. Tech and innovation should deliver solutions that are transparent, secure, available, reliable, durable, and mindful of privacy considerations. Now, on to today's topic. Today's the first of 2 Tech and Innovation Center sessions highlighting the Technology and Innovation Awards made through the U.S. Department of Transportation's 2022 SMART Grants Program. I'm now going to invite my friend and partner, Anthony Townsend from Cornell Tech, to ground us in some context about today's topic and discussion. Anthony, let me pass you the mic.
Thank you, Tina. Welcome, everybody. Welcome back. This is a really exciting opportunity for us because the last 6 sessions that we've done as part of the Tech and Innovation series have been looking forward at notices of funding that were either anticipated in the near future or already out on the street. This is the first time that we're able to look back and see how the first round of some of the IIJ programs have fared and the awards that they've made. So we're going to be doing that for this session and the next session on July 12th as well, and focusing in on the SMART program from US DOT. In my view, SMART is the most tech forward of all the programs that were created by the IIJA, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And it's really zeroing in on 8 technology domains in transportation and trying to push those forward. All the SMART projects leverage one or more of these technology areas. Can I have the next slide, please? Just some basic facts about the awards that were announced this past March from the fiscal year 2020 cycle. There were $94 million in stage 1 grants to 59 different projects. All of the grants that were made this year were stage 1 grants, which are for planning and prototyping, up to $2 million. We're anticipating that stage 1 funding is basically the first step of the program, and then stage 2 grants, which we expect to be made available this year, will fund up to $15 million for implementation of the projects planned in stage 1 projects. Next slide, please. We're still waiting details, but we're anticipating that there will be stage 2 grants, but also a new cohort of stage 1 grants. So cities and towns that didn't get a chance to get started last year through this program, we expect we'll have a chance again. And the timeline, what we're expecting is similar to last year. that August, September, the notice of funding opportunity will become available. Applications, I believe last year was mid-November. It's on a slightly more aggressive time frame this year, it appears, although that information will be forthcoming, but about a 3-month window. And then again, as the proposals are evaluated, March of 2024 would be when we expect to know who will be funded. And this is all subject to change as DOT finalizes its timetable. Next slide, please. So for these 2 sessions, we really wanted to zero in on one of these technology domains and kind of really tear it apart and understand what cities are doing and what technologies are involved and all the issues and opportunities that raises. And the one that really jumped out at me when I was looking through the awards was 9 grants that were made for curb management projects. Next slide, please. And this is something that has been bubbling up in the transportation community for almost a decade now, that curbs are really the point of intervention where cities can assert their authority across the board, whether it's parking or freight or whatever. It's really the kind of piece of infrastructure that cities are able to leverage. Unfortunately, it's been kind of stuck in the 19th, early 20th century for quite some time. And so the idea of digitizing cities' curb assets, as well as the regulations that are layered on top of those assets, has been seen as the first step in unlocking the value of this underutilized infrastructure. And what you're looking at here is actually a prototype that was not done by a city, it was done by the Center City District, a BID, Business Improvement District in Philadelphia, along with a local geospatial consultancy, Azavea. And this is really an early proof of concept of how new data standards could be used to quickly create this kind of infrastructure. Next slide, please. So yeah, the idea of digitizing curbs has been around for about a decade. Over the last 5 years, there's really been a furious push to develop this technology. Good bit of that began in the private sector. So Sidewalk Labs / Alphabet's startup Cord developed a computer vision system for actually digitizing curb regulations from Google Street View imagery. The next year, Shared Streets, an NGO, released 2 data standards for encoding both the geometry of curbs as well as those regulations. And then last year, the Open Mobility Foundation released a curb data specification. And that really builds on the Shared Streets work and defines how cities and third parties can exchange data about activity and uses of curbs. And of course, this year we had US DOT SMART fund 9 curb data projects nationwide. Next slide. So these are the 9 cities that received prototyping awards. As you can see, they're really representing the whole cross-section of the country, cities big and small, newer cities and older cities. So really, I think the program is going to be incubating a huge variety of experiments. Next slide, please. So what we're going to do today is zero in on what is one of the kind of killer apps for digital curbs, which is managing freight and delivery. 3 of the city SMART grants are focused on freight. We're joined today by folks from Seattle, as well as their research partners at the University of Washington. Miami and Portland are also pursuing digital curb projects for freight. And we're also joined today by Philadelphia, which is one of the cities that received a curb digitization grant. That project, as I understand it, we'll hear more in a moment, is not about freight, but it's building on a freight management project that happened previously. So we'll get to see kind of what these projects look like going in, as well as what they look like coming out. And then next week, we're going to shift a little bit more to the fundamentals and look at what's involved in building this foundational data layer for curb management that will enable all kinds of different uses. So a little bit more of the capacity building conversation. And we're right now in the process of reaching out to Los Angeles, Buffalo, Minneapolis, San Francisco, and San Jose, as well as the Open Mobility Foundation, which is an NGO that is coordinating the work of 8 of 9 of these cities nationwide. And so we'll also hopefully be able to have a conversation with them about how that network could be expanded in the future and what the opportunities are for cities to participate in that. I think that's my last slide. I'll go to the next one.
Thank you, Anthony. I love that as we orient ourselves to today's discussion, I want you to keep those words in your mind. Killer app for curb management, everybody. So I'm really excited about our speakers today. Again, building off that context of what's happening in this space that Anthony just shared. So joining us today are Brian Hamlin, who's the Seattle Department of Transportation's Curbside Management Strategic Advisor, Akshay Malik, who's the Director of Smart Cities for the City of Philadelphia, and last but certainly not least, Kelly Rula, who is the Director of Policy and Partnerships at the University of Washington's Urban Freight Lab. So warm welcome to our 3 speakers. And before we start learning about the work of our panelists, we want to take a moment to ask a quick poll question of the audience. So the question we want to get your input on, it'll pop up in just a moment. There it is. Is your city currently working to address challenges related to urban freight? We want to get a sense of the extent to which y'all are actively working on this for your community. So we'll give you a moment to respond. Excellent. Thanks for providing input, everyone. And Manny, I think we can take the slides down. And I want to start off with some questions for Brian. And I promise it's not just because I live in Seattle and Brian works for the city of Seattle. So Brian, thanks so much for joining us. We're really excited to hear about the work of the SMART grant. But first, before we get into that, again, this is not just my bias, but my understanding is that Seattle's a little ahead of the game in terms of work that y'all are doing to regulate freight and delivery. Can you share a little bit about that with us? How are you doing that work today?
Yeah, for sure. So thank you, Tina. Yeah, so we've got a few things going on in Seattle, and we've been doing some work at managing urban freight at the curb for many years now. Specifically, we have, at least in our kind of paid parking areas around the city, we have what we call commercial vehicle load zones. And specifically, you need to pay to access those zones. So this is some of our most prime real estate that we have dedicated to commercial vehicles, and they're allowed to park there. And one of the ways that we manage access to that space is we have a commercial vehicle permit that fleets and vendors can apply for. It's like a $250 little sticker decal goes on the side of it. It's not smart at all. And you get kind of carte blanche to all the load zones across the city. And that worked for a while. Vehicles had access to this space. And well, actually, before I get into the challenges, I'll talk about some other, toot our horn a little bit. So that's great, and it's worked for several years. But one of the other things that we've done to help us manage commercial freight and access at the curb is we have digitized our entire curb. We have a digital curb inventory of our kind of downtown core. Again, it's like where we have our paid parking areas. We have a very granular space by space measurement that's totally digitized, so we know where all the curb bulbs are, the driveways, the passenger load zones, the commercial vehicle load zones. And it's worked really, really well for us. But it's something that we created many, many years ago. And as things have started to evolve and develop, we're starting to see some cracks around the seams.
Got it. Well, and can you share a little bit more about what's working and what's not working with that current system?
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of alluded to it, but that little sticker decal that vehicles can put on the side of their trucks, it's really hard. You don't get any information out of that. Like we don't understand what curb utilization is like. Where are those vehicles going, like how activated are particular curb spaces? Where are our policies failing them? Right. The sticker works really well for enforcement officers. They can just walk along the block and see like sticker, yes, no, great. But what's happened over, and I'm sure everybody on this call can attest to it. All you got to do if you live in a city, you go out and look at your curb spaces. But the number of vehicles that are illegally using those zones is just skyrocketed. So there's way too many different types of vehicles and activities happening at this once like prized dedicated space that was just for these commercial vehicles. So it's really hard to manage the vehicles that are actually supposed to be using that space. And I think anecdotally what we're seeing is not as many drivers and delivery companies are actually purchasing those permits anymore, because I don't think they see the value in it as much, because our enforcement officers can't keep up with the demand. There's so many vehicles out there, you kind of get lost in the noise. So it's kind of forced us to take a step back and be like, we need to actually reevaluate our approach to managing this space. So that's just for the commercial zones. And then as far as the curb data that we have, again, it's worked really well for many years now, but as new needs have arisen and new technologies, connected vehicles, smart vehicles, we can't actually communicate our load zones out to the users that want to use that space. Like I can't just plug it into Google or some flashy new app. Like they just don't talk to each other, because the way that it's written is a decade ago, and specifications and standards have evolved drastically since then. So this is something we're really trying to take on to be like, okay, we kind of like to be at the forefront of technology, but now we're starting to slip a little bit. So we want to jump forward.
Well, I want to hear about how the SMART grant's going to help you do that. But before I move on, we got a great question from Josh O'Neill, who's asking for the digital curb inventory. How long does a project like that take? And how much field time would you estimate is needed?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And it's kind of evolved over the years. And I think from us, there was that initial data collection effort to try to go out and map the curbs. That took a really long time, I'm sure, well before I was here at SDOT. But once that practice is established, so now when we have new signs that get installed out in the field, or if we have, for example, a bike multimodal project, bike lanes, transit lanes, they go and kind of change the right of way along a corridor. We have a work plan process that, from beginning to end, it's all digitized, and there's a process in place for, we're going to go out and change the sign. All this data is going to get updated, and it gets handed off to the next staff. The next staff, honestly, it's too many people that are handling it, which makes it really slow. But it's a process that's worked, and because of that, we have like pretty good data. But that initial data collection effort, pretty slow. But I really need to stress that you have to have an ongoing process to continue to update that data as things are your signs, your curb zones are updated over time. Because then all that money you invested earlier, that time and money, will quickly be outdated, and then you're begging your city council for money to like do it all again 5 years later.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I appreciate Kelly sort of reiterating that point. That again aligns to one of our themes around thinking about sustainability when you think about introducing new technology or innovation. It's not just that startup cost, right? If you want it to really have the value that it can have, you got to think about that ongoing sort of maintenance piece. Brian, I do want to steer us back to over to the SMART grant. I want to understand, what problem are you trying to solve, and what is the pilot project that you proposed involve?
Yeah, so very exciting, and I think perfect segue from what I was talking about. The problem we're trying to solve really is getting a handle on on-demand delivery, like really deliveries, urban freight, urban goods movement in our downtowns, in our densest neighborhoods, is getting a handle on that. And by handle, I mean, providing for the highest and best use at the curb, which is often that short-term delivery access to support our local businesses and our residents that live in, really dense high-rise buildings that don't have off-street parking access. Like, we need to provide space for them, and we need to make sure that us as a city, we're creating policies that enable that access to happen. So that's a real big problem that we're trying to solve, is how can we use new digital tools, new data standards to help us try to solve this kind of last mile urban freight problem of making sure that we can connect delivery vehicles to the space that they absolutely need, because it's different than paid parking, for example. Like we charge for paid parking in the city, and we'll raise rates when occupancy is really high to maybe try to deter trips, but those deliveries, they're not as elastic. Like they're going to make the delivery no matter what. So we have to ensure that there's space for it. And there's a lot of technology that's out there now that can help us better manage this incredibly valuable and limited space. So for the SMART grant, what we applied for is we wanted to essentially, and this could change, of course, but we essentially want to digitize our commercial vehicle program, our permit program. Because again, like I said, that physical sticker gives us no information. We get no detail on utilization at the curb, what that looks like. So we want to have some type of infrastructure in place, and we're still figuring out what that might look like, that can essentially measure vehicles at the curb, and what we call vehicle to curb infrastructure. Essentially, like that could be a sensor, it could be a camera, it could be RFID chips, something that way we can connect a vehicle to that space, and then we know how long they were there for, and if our policies are actually working for those types of vehicles, right? And I think these types of tools and different technologies, right, that'll help us with that problem, but it's also going to help us be more proactive in curb management. So if we start thinking about how do we incentivize EVs or zero emission load zones specific to EVs, or like off-peak loading for different types of trucks and vehicles that are moving in and out of the city, we can't really do that until we have like a totally digital system where we can make the tweaks and have those tweaks implemented, almost immediately. So at a very high level, that's what we're looking to achieve with this grant, is we want to test out some of those technologies, see what will work in Seattle, and see what we can then scale to a phase 2 of the SMART grant, where we do a much broader citywide program as opposed to just kind of a smaller one. And I will say, Kelly at the Urban Freight Lab, their incredible researchers are going to be helping us answer those questions, because it's not going to be easy.
That's a great plug. And Brian, real quickly, can you speak before we shift to hear about Akshay's work in Philly? Just want to help get your thoughts on what's the role of curb data in this pilot project.
Yeah, so curb data, hugely important. Shameless plug, I've been a member of the Open Mobility Foundation's curb data specification working group since the beginning. So we in Seattle think this is super important. It aligns, the mission that they have aligns very closely with what we want to do with our future program. So, curb data is everything. We can't manage what we can't measure. And we have a history of collecting data, but it's been very siloed, and it doesn't talk to each other, and it doesn't communicate outside of Seattle particularly well. So things like the curb data specification are going to allow us to kind of stitch everything together and have this common language that we can, with our SMART grant, we can layer that technology and that solution that we're going to try to solve that problem with. It's going to be layered on top of this common data standard that the other cities that you had mentioned earlier in the call today, that we're all going to be using the same data standard. So that way we can compare what's happening in Seattle to what's happening in Philly or what's happening in San Francisco. And we can have a much more educated and robust conversation about like what's actually working in your city. And maybe we should take a little bit of that and add a little dash of Seattle spice to it and see what works here. But we can't really have that conversation until we're all on the same standard.
I really appreciate that point. I think that just particularly in thinking about transferability of lessons learned, and then also like bringing together other cities to collaborate on in terms of problem solving on similar challenges, that sounds hugely valuable. Thank you, Brian. We're going to come back to you in a bit. But Akshay, I want to hear about work that's happening in Philly. And first I have to ask, What's interesting is you have a really interesting job title, and it does not include the word transportation. You are Philadelphia's Smart Cities Director. Can you help us understand, how did you as the Smart Cities Director get involved in this work?
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity. And yeah, first of all, my background is in transportation with the city. I was working for 4 years with the Office of Transportation, Infrastructure and Sustainability, called OTIS in short. It's part of our managing director's office, and I was the data nerd for everything transportation, doing all kinds of analysis like levels of services for streets, for safety analysis. I was the data person for the Vision Zero program. If you guys have heard of like the high injury network that Philly put out, I developed that and made the methodology around it. So a lot of work in transportation before I came to Smart Cities team. And the reason I came to Smart Cities team was to deploy the Smart Loading Zone project in a way, because the deputy managing director who leads the group that I mentioned, OTIS, Office of Transportation, is the co-chair of our Smart Cities work as a city. And when I had pitched this project back in 2018, this is back when Quad was around, and I saw Quad being mentioned in the slides earlier. And there was some brainstorming that I did through a project called Philadelphia's Transportation Data Roadmap. If people Google it, you'll find it on city's website. That's when we were talking about data being part of the transportation infrastructure. And me being the data nerd, I was leading that work. 2 projects as goals or as targets for piloting came out of that report. One was a smart curb management system. When I moved to the Smart Cities team, this became my first project, and it was like a cool gig. As I think I mentioned earlier, some of you, it's a privileged space where I don't get to put out fires like all my colleagues in the transportation world. I'm sure everybody's heard of I-95 stuff that happened. I used to work with a folks. So like, I don't get to put out any fires, and that's a privilege. I get to sit back and see what the problem is and how we can go about trying to solve it. In my current portfolio, in my current role, we structure the portfolio to have mobility as one of our biggest verticals. We also do non-mobility infrastructure and pure software systems as well. And that's how this sort of fell in my world.
That's great. Well, let's sort of double click on that mobility part of your portfolio, and would love for you to share more about this Smart Loading Zone pilot, which, as I understand it, wrapped up in the spring. I'd love for you to share with the group today, what was the problem that Philadelphia was trying to solve, and what's the solution that you ended up testing?
Right. So the problem was that I think it was a lot of similar problems as you heard from Brian. Every city sort of struggles with similar issues. What's a not smart loading zone? We call it conventional in our FAQs, because opposite of smart would be a really hard word. The conventional loading zones in Philly, and before I go there, I would say there is a little bit of organizational difference from other cities. We have something called Philadelphia Parking Authority, which is a state-owned or state-managed agency, and it's not part of the city's administrative umbrella. So unlike other cities where parking and curb management would be part of their DOT or city administrative work, it's not the case in Philly. And that was one of the problems I faced when I was doing, as I mentioned, the other project, Philadelphia's Transportation Data Roadmap, which was to say, all these agencies that are somehow operating, planning, or managing cities' transportation infrastructure, they're not in the same administrative umbrella. And therefore, they're all on different levels in terms of their data infrastructure. Yeah. And what happens is they do not talk to each other, because one can speak API and the other is still at Excel sheets, and some people are still at those folded dot printed sheets. So I'm not kidding, that exists. So coming to today to the Smart Loading Zone project, we realized that the conventional loading zones were based on somebody asking for them and paying up an annual fee. And when that person or that business would move around or did not pay up, we couldn't just remove it. There was no sort of tracking of demand and supply of loading space. It was just being done anecdotally. It was not being monitored or measured. The only measure was if a business asked for it, we gave it. If nobody had a major red flag about it. We couldn't track who was using it. Nobody paid a fee, like how you would pay a fee at a metered spot. And there was no penalty beyond somebody like the enforcement officers tracking if you've gone beyond the 1 hour or whatever limit was set for that type of loading zone. So it was not meeting the demands. And we know that not by anecdotal issues, but because, as I said, I was working with Vision Zero, we saw a lot of unsafe behavior, people parking in bike lanes, on crosswalks, on sidewalks. I'm sure I have pictures of that. So the unsafe behavior was very visible. And the problem was not just that. Problem was if you went with a stick versus the carrot, as in increase the fine, the companies would just bake it into the business model and pass on the fine to their customer, right? You're not trying to solve, that's not a solution that we can go with in the first go. So we had to come up with a carrot that would try and understand what the problem is, try and provide them the data standard that Brian talked about, the curb data specification. This was right on the heels of the first 1.0 release of CDS, where we could digitally allow people to see what's available, see the space on their app, like an app, and reserve it in advance, given a certain distance from that location, given the time of the day and all the regulations that are coming as part of that space. And we designed it so that it could be, some spaces were specifically for loading and some were open to, some were specific to commercial plates. So if you're a box truck driver or you have a commercial license plate on the vehicle, you can use, they're called truck loading only. And there were others that were open to anybody who wants to use a loading zone. And we opened up both in our pilot. There were 20 loading zones. We went with Google, a company called Squad that was mentioned earlier, was bought over by Sidewalk Labs, and Sidewalk Labs was bought by Google. So we're basically dealing with Google. And to circle back, the biggest problem we were trying to solve was your user experience, which is traditionally not talked about in physical infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Imagine your user experience as you go from point A, you start from your home and you want to come into Center City, you use Google Maps, you put in the location you want to go to, and you get this amazing user experience of left, right, straight navigation, and you reach at this spot, and now your user experience falls off a cliff because now you need to get down from your car, figure out, can I park here given all the stuff posted on the curbside? And then by the time you figure out, you've already wasted time, you block traffic, God knows what other unsafe traffic behavior has happened. So that's the user experience issue we were also trying to solve. And all that said, we had OMF and CDS, the Open Mobility Foundation, releasing curb data specification to actually roll this project out. So that's at a high level, the problem we were trying to solve. Okay. What we hoped would also get solved, but did not, was the operations of city planning stuff, procedures or parking authorities planning workflows would get integrated. And that did not happen. Okay. Because the idea was that we'll showcase, this standard works, there is the software and everybody would start using it. But that was not the case because we were focusing on the narrow sliver of the right of way that was of least interest to everybody else from the operations world. Right? There you go. The most interested in this whole thing were lawyers who were trying to keep a record of what was posted on the website. And currently they would go around with clipboards and take notes for office of record, spend lots of hours per block. But yeah, that was a big disconnect in where we landed.
Okay. Well, as I understand it, I want to pivot and invite you to sort of quickly summarize your city's SMART proposal, which was selected. And as I understand it, it's going to digitize the right-of-way more broadly. Can you, in 1 to 2 minutes, tell us about what that SMART proposal involves?
Sure. So, as I said, the sliver that we were operationally least interested in got the most attention in the pilot that we just did. And we realized that we needed to digitize more across the right of way. This was also on the heels of another project that I was involved in, and we're about to buy about $1 million worth of software for street closure permitting system, which would allow us to sort of look at what section of the street should be closed. And it basically impacts whether you can traverse the section of that right of way or not. I don't know if those slides are there. Manuel, can you? Okay, there we go.
Thank you, Manny.
So the biggest problem we were trying to solve was for spatial granularity of our streets. As I said, we were able to digitize curbs, but as you can see in this chart, this is like a street closure rate chart. So if you're seeking a street closure from the city, we would charge you per lane per foot. But we never had the capacity or the spatial granularity in our base maps to actually ask you where do you want that closure, or respond in a way that would be digitally viable for that type of data. So if you move to the next slide, you'll see what can we go to the next slide, please? So say you want to hold that red spot as a street closure, right? Now it has curb space as a data along with it, but the systems that the city uses has a baseline data set of centerline data. So when we try to, like as a user or a citizen, I'm trying to say to the city, I need that red box. The system would allow me only to click on, if you go to the next slide, no, that's the other way. Yeah. So that's the minimum amount of area that you can click on. So I just needed the red box in the previous slide. But when I go to the system gives me a centerline data that is essentially an abstraction of everything that you see in the red. So the granularity of the baseline data is missing. And it's hard for somebody who's trying to seek permit to express that or use the street. And then if you go to the next slide, and there are 3 different users trying to hold 3 different spots on the street, allowing the street to still continue to function, but these are 3 different spots. They will be technically in conflict if we use the centerline data as a baseline, right? So that's spatial granularity, as I called it, was missing in our base maps. And that was a deterrent for us to take our curb data specification work to the entire operations of streets department, right? And extend it towards the street closure permitting system that we were investing heavily in. So that gap of spatial granularity plugged with or coupled with sensors or camera systems that would allow us to monitor and plan and enforce right-of-way regulations in real time is something that we're doing for our smart grant.
That is super exciting. Thank you, Akshay. Thank you, Manny, for popping those slides up. You can take those down now. And I think actually I would not be surprised if we're going to see some questions in the chat for you. But I now want to come to our third speaker, Kelly. And Kelly, I'm excited to have you on. We usually have a bias towards having city representatives of city government. But what we've also heard as a common theme through the first 6 sessions of this series is about the critical importance of partnerships and the need to identify folks outside of your city org chart that you can partner with to achieve a shared goal. So I'm delighted you're here and would love to better appreciate your role as a partner to the Seattle Department of Transportation in this pilot project. Can you tell us a little bit about your role and what you're hoping to learn at the Urban Freight Lab?
Sure. And I'll just say I did just come from Seattle DOT previously. So I do have that city experience, which I think is super important. Yeah, I guess quick on the Urban Freight Lab. So we are an interesting public-private academic partnership. So we have a membership-based group with private members in the urban freight space. So folks like Amazon, UPS, Michelin, we just added a locker company, some RFID companies. And the idea is to really bring that public-private academic together to think about research in this space. And so Seattle DOT has been our flagship public partner, and New York City DOT has been increasingly more involved on their freight team. So we are pretty unique and really love nerding out on this space. in relation to the Seattle Smart Project, because we're based here in Seattle, we've done a lot of work with Seattle DOT over the years, including a recent Department of Energy grant on curb and sensors. So we have both a long history of partnership with them. We also have a lot of long history of like actually working, in the real world in Seattle and specifically on curb space. So when this sort of curb project idea was being floated around, it was sort of a no-brainer, I think, for both sides to say, oh yeah, of course we want to be involved as researchers. And I think Seattle's, oh yes, we've worked with you before. So we'll be supporting, we've been kind of in lockstep with our friends at Seattle DOT and my former colleagues, which makes it fun. We'll be supporting things like data collection, kind of advising more broadly on the project, and data collection, both kind of looking at the technology and the data streams we're getting, as well as we'll be kind of adding some flavor around surveys, or we do a lot of qualitative work, research data collection, so ride-alongs, intercept surveys, actually having people kind of out to observe, because you can learn a lot from kind of technology systems, which again is where we're talking about scaling, but you can also learn a lot from really having just a person observing that kind of complexity or that granularity that sometimes gets obfuscated when you're looking at bigger data sets and sort of aggregated numbers. So again, we're actually going to be looking at a similar service area and kind of expanding on that, what we did with our Department of Energy grant. So we already have a lot of good, rich data that we can kind of leverage into this project. And I am excited because I think Seattle is such a leader in this space, and this project is unique in the SMART cohort in really kind of going a little more niche into this permit program aspect. So we're hoping to learn more about user segments. So Brian kind of touched on this, but we know we have a cohort already of people that use the permit program. We know that cohort is diverse, meaning we have UPS drivers that have permits. We also know that there's likely a lot of mom and pop or local businesses that buy a permit so they can do unloading into their local restaurant and maybe aren't even making external consumer deliveries. So we want to be able to, like Brian touched on, extract more information around the use of the curb at the kind of user segment level, because that will ultimately help us to really think about which policies are working. And Brian also touched on this. I think there's been a lot of research and work on paid parking and sort of passenger movements at the curb. There's been a lot of study, lengthy, Donald Shoup, there's sort of famous people in the space, and commercial is really just starting to get looked at more. And so we're still very early days on what are the right policies and pricing and schemes to be approaching commercial activity, especially in the advent of e-commerce and home delivery explosion. What does that look like? And how are we looking at forward-looking policies to drive towards decarbonization of the freight space? That was a lot.
This is really energizing. I just want to call something out that I'm hearing from both Philadelphia's work and from Seattle's work, is this emphasis on your users, whether it's on their experience the experience that they have in accessing and utilizing curb space, but also, I mean, Kelly, you just talked about ride-alongs and incept interviews. So thinking about user research as a way to inform these technology efforts, which is fantastic to hear. Again, you're designing for those that are going to use it, which is something that that this series is always eager to lift up. So that's really exciting. Let me ask you, what kinds of future applications do you think can be unlocked with a fully digital loading zone permit? Like what might some of those possibilities be?
Yeah, I think, we're in partnership with Seattle. We're thinking about, as I just mentioned, the policy side. So what can a deeper understanding again across user segments unlock for us from a policy, kind of creating legislation and policy? So I think that fits in your tech, not just for tech's sake. I think this is really all in service towards building better, data-driven policy around commercial vehicle use. And I think, again, we're pretty early days. Like Seattle is more advanced because they have some longstanding programs. but things are changing, and frankly, we don't have that richness of understanding at the user level that we want to build. I think again, Seattle wants to build the right types of policies to address ultimately like decarbonization and access at the curb. And the curb, is one of our strong levers in the United States. When you look at, New York, I just saw the congestion pricing is moving. It's the only city so far. So there's a lot of focus on curb because it's a kind of long-standing place where local authorities have regulatory structures in place. And so it is kind of our strong lever to start to drive behavior changes. And so we're really looking at this project as getting to that next level of richness of understanding on the commercial drivers and how they're using the curb and how we can start to influence their behaviors towards those, like I said, the things that we want to see in cities.
That's fantastic. I have one more question for Kelly, but I also want to put a plug for our audience. Please drop your questions for any and all speakers into the chat, because I'm going to ask Kelly one more question, and then we want to come and understand what's top of mind for all of you. But Kelly, before we get there, so something really interesting that Anthony teed up in his sort of overall context that he shared with us was that 8 cities are doing this all at the same time and working together through the Open Mobility Foundation. I'd love to hear, given you have city government experience and now you're in this research role, what do you think that we can learn from those cities that are all testing, similar but also slightly different approaches?
Yeah. I think to me, one of the more exciting things is just being able to like leverage and in some ways like leapfrog, learn from each other's mistakes and leapfrog, accelerate faster, right? We need to be kind of testing, piloting, iterating, and going very fast, especially when we're sort of thinking in the context of climate. And so I'm excited that I think because USCFC was smart enough to give a number of these at the same time, I think hopefully we will be able to leapfrog some mistakes out of this cohort moving forward that will benefit both cities, but also like the technology industry. I think we're going to learn a lot about product quality control. I think all these technologies come with nothing. There's no kind of silver bullet here to like solve your curb problems. And I think it's going to be really helpful to see lots of different things deployed at once and really be able to do that analysis and synthesis at the end. And, the winners will rise and the kind of losers will fall out. But I think that in some ways will go faster than if we didn't do something in this kind of cohort model. So I'm excited about that. And then I think as they talked about with the curb data specification, if you think about, again, the end users and how other applications can benefit, beyond freight, I worked on, Uber and Lyft policy a lot before. So thinking about how does this digitized curb affect how we regulate or how we drive behaviors we want in the for-hire industry and even in passenger vehicle movements. I was on a panel with INRIX and they're talking about how they have parking data in the head navigation centers in your car, which would potentially take you right to a spot at the curb. So thinking about how can this cohort unlock other future applications of technology is really exciting. And then a last thing, from a research perspective, we love data and we love standardized data so we can do comparative studies. And so I'm very excited about what this will unlock in the future in terms of what we saw from the mobility data specification, which looked at shared mobility data. There's been lots of national studies looking at scooter movements and things like that. And again, huge learnings and leverage from that opportunity that I think we'll be able to, we're at the early days, but exciting stuff coming.
That is super exciting. And I just want to highlight that point about there's going to be some successes and then there's going to be some things that don't work as well. And that in and of itself is also a successful learning, right? Because then like that cohort is going to be able to translate and share those out to other communities that are on our call today and elsewhere. And I think that in and of itself is a great thing, right? Like let's do the work. And if something doesn't work, let's talk about that so that others don't replicate that mistake. I want to ask one question to Brian and Akshay, and that question is: what advice do you have for cities thinking about the 2023 Smart NOFO? If you have any particular thoughts on what was effective, what wasn't, what you would do differently if you were submitting an application this August. Want to make space for the cities and communities on our call to hear your thoughts on that. And Brian, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, lots of thoughts on that. I would say first, give yourself more time than you think you need to fill out that NOFO response. But other than that, I would say I would really try, if you're even remotely interested in it, try to get engaged with the cities like myself, Philly, that are participating in it now. Because that's kind of the whole point. We're this block of cities that are working on this, and we're all going to have really good lessons learned. And we can help you through it, like the challenges, just even like the simple stuff. I lean on Kelly and the Urban Freight Labs team a lot to help with program design and development, because we're just stuck in the weeds doing grant management and like just that bureaucratic day-to-day stuff, right? So I would say, engage with us on that, so that way you can kind of grease the wheels a bit, so that way if you do apply and are awarded, you can just hit the ground running and go with it, and you're not going to get caught up in the same things that we are. And then finally, as a more programmatic response, I would say, really, really think about that. What is your problem you're trying to solve? And you're not just doing technology for technology's sake, because you're just going to end up in a whole world of hurt, assuming that you're awarded the grant. Then you actually got to implement on it and have some like deliverables, right? So make sure you just gotta have a really solid problem first, and then build on the lessons learned from others to, try to solve that problem.
Love that advice, Brian. Actually, anything you would add from Philly?
Ditto to everything Brian said. I'll just expand on one of the things that he mentioned at the last, that being in a smart cities role, I've kind of created a process around how we explore problems. And it's usually talking to the people who are boots on the ground, or people who are literally at the operational end of your org chart. There's a huge amount of learning that leadership in agencies can have if they speak to like people who are trying to get services delivered or get things done. I've been that conduit between like getting those interviews done, etc. And that really helped us sort of understand what was the missing gap. Even after spending so much money on a street closure permitting system, we won't be able to do street closure permitting. So that is one thing that I wanted to expand on. And the second is, I think it's important to assign a role to somebody who can do a technology landscape assessment. I think OMF specifically helped us in Philly to understand the breadth of the technology landscape that otherwise would be hidden from the traditional scan that cities do for their RFIs or RFPs. And that gives you a sense of what is possible out there, because there's a way to discover the problem, but then you need to also make sure there is a solution that you can buy off the shelf and not like spend $2 million making it through a massive company. But yeah.
Thank you, Akshay. Kelly, what would you?
I kind of want to add something too. I was just going to add, and I think Akshay and Brian will agree, but 18 months is very short. And I think the DOT is going to be pretty strict because they're trying to do phase 1 and phase 2 around extensions. So my advice there, from kind of putting the researcher and the knowing how cities work, we've had a lot of already conversations around procurement, which is a big challenge. But really being strategic about what you design for your pilot or your prototype. It doesn't need to run for 12 months. It can be very short. And in fact, a lot of the UFL projects run on a very short time frame, but we're still able to extract great learnings from that. So really be strategic about what your 18 months looks like. And in some ways, putting that time in up front on the planning, even before you get started, so that you can hit the ground running when your clock starts. I think that's going to be a big learning, and it's okay to not propose the moon. It's okay, I think, to propose something a little more realistic for this particular grant.
Love that point. And again, just to recap some of that advice we just heard, keep implementation in mind, be strategic because 18 months is short, build on past efforts, and leverage resources like technology landscape assessments that others have done, so you don't have to recreate the wheel in your community. At this point, I'm going to come in just a moment to invite Josh O'Neill to come off mute and ask a question. But first, we want to get your thoughts on 2 final poll questions. So while folks are responding to those two questions, we'll give you a moment, and then Josh will invite you to pose the question that you put in the chat to our speakers. And Josh, you should feel free to go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for giving me a chance to speak. Yeah, basically just kind of wondering, I do freight planning work for the state of Rhode Island, and our MPO, the Division of Statewide Planning, is actually the MPO for the entire state, but we're a small state. So we work with 39 municipalities very closely, and we've done some work trying to deconflict freight planning issues at the local level for municipalities of all sizes, from our capital city to smaller rural suburban communities. And one thing that seems to be kind of the missing link a lot of these times is the actual outreach to truck drivers, and really working with the trucking associations. And it's hard because they're busy, but trying to get in-person interviews with truck drivers if you can. And from what we've gathered doing a statewide truck parking study, we did interview some companies that do urban deliveries for food and beverage industry. And they were just kind of saying, like, it's your job to deconflict these user conflicts. And if you're going to charge us a higher fee, we're just going to pass on, those costs to the consumer. To an earlier point, I think it was Brian maybe that brought that up. So it's, as you're managing the curb and you're looking at the data and deconflicting uses, and you're charging for the use of the curb, just kind of think that, what is the best use of that to optimize that freight delivery so that it doesn't conflict or create congestion? Because on the cost thing, from what I've gathered, like these companies are just happy to pass on the buck,
Yeah, so I know we're almost out of time, but I'd invite our panelists in 30 seconds or less, if you can share with us how you think about engagement with delivery companies and workers, again, as a part of that user research and thinking about the user experience. So what are your quick thoughts on that before we wrap?
Should we go? Okay. So quick note, we did this in our pilot, and we went and did like surveys and information gathering from people who were using the zones. It did not work for anybody who had a handheld. So FedEx, UPS, all the companies that have a handheld, it won't work. We stayed away from camera technology for privacy reasons initially for our pilot, but I think camera has the advantage, and we are in our scale up for like loading zone work. We are looking at camera technologies where nobody has to sign up. It's basically a tolling situation for somebody at the curb. And that takes away a lot of buy-in issues that you need from people who are running these enterprise handheld devices. But yeah, that's a quick suggestion.
Thank you, Brian, can I invite you to share if you've done engagement? I know Kelly referenced this, so it sounds like the urban freight does, but what about
Yes. Super quick. Again, yeah, Kelly nailed it. Like, we can leverage the Urban Freight Lab connections and like being able to talk to those folks directly. And I think leaning on Akshay's point and what it looks like in Seattle, like we have an existing permit program with people that are signed up that have been engaged for many, many years. So we'd like to leverage that and directly speak to them where we can and figure out how we can make this seamless experience. Because I think Akshay nailed it. Like, it's going to be super hard to make anybody do anything else, and then they're going to pay more. We don't want this to be a cash grab. We want to figure out a way to actually improve curb access, but still balancing all our other city policy goals. So yeah, it's a super loaded question, and I could talk forever, but yeah, there's challenges there.
Well, thank you, and it's a good thing that we're going to have another session to continue this this topic of the 2023 Smart NOFO and lessons learned. I want to say thanks to all of our speakers. I want to say thanks to all of you for participating. Our next session will be on July 12th, so please do save the date. And remember that the Local Infrastructure Hub website is a great way to see upcoming events and to learn about other resources available through the Hub. So please do check it out. As Jamie put in the chat, we've got a great discussion coming up on July 11th with US DOT's Reconnecting Communities program. Want to also remind you, the Hub has a newsletter that it's sending out. So if you haven't received it, we'll make sure a link is shared in the chat. Thanks to our speakers for making yourselves available and sharing your contact information. This is truly in the spirit of all of us learning together and learning from one another. So Brian, Akshay, and Kelly, big thanks to y'all. And everyone, we'll see you next time. Take good care and happy 4th of July.
Thank you. Bye, guys.